So, the second largest economy in the world, which, as you pointed out, is absolutely crucial to our current globalized interconnectedness. Almost, I think it's 50% of the world's manufacturing comes out of China, 60% of the world's trade comes through China. This nation is currently participating in a attempted genocide. How is this not more spoken of, well known? Where is the sort of visceral reaction? Is it just too early for us to know? Do you think it's coming? Do people somehow just not care? I'm not sure. Like, what do you make of it?
So I have strong opinions about this. So I think one of the big problems that we've run in international affairs is that we've been sold a fundamental lie by our elites in democratic societies. Not just in America, but I think across the democratic world, across the West, we've been sold a fundamental mistruth for the past 30 years that engaging with China and working with an authoritarian regime and trading with it is 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 inevitably going to open it up, is going to allow its
Sure, and
people it's going to
democratize them.
democratize them. It's going to create a middle class that's going to want change, that they're looking out for their own interests, private property rights, privacy. um, China. I mean, China is it's economically it's one of the biggest success stories ever. In terms of the number of people that the party since the era of Deng Xiaoping has lifted out of poverty.
Mm, mm,
Now, the fundamental lie is that if you go back in history, just right before Deng Xiaoping, who was the Chinese premier who set his reforms, you just go back a little bit further and you realize that the Chinese Communist Party was the institution that just pummeled the nation into the ground. From a standing of, obviously China wasn't doing great when the Communist Party took over, but took whatever was left of China and just destroyed it. Just, destroyed the
mm-hmm,
institutions,
mm-hmm.
seized people's lands, just killed untold numbers of people, purged them, executed them, imprisoned them. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this. And then we
Mm-hmm.
expect the Chinese Communist Party to reform on its own and then to suddenly say,
Mm-mm.
oh,
The same government that's in
yeah,
now.
so we're going to destroy the country and then we're going to repair the country. So,
Mm-hmm.
when people, and I just said this is a major economic success story, but when you put it in that context, it's actually not a huge success because China was created the problem in the first place. Um,
Yeah.
I always have to, I always try to temper statements like that, and just be careful about those types of statements. So, um, like I think that so we've been sold this fundamental mistruth about China and its future as a democratic or a quasi authoritarian state. It's going to change its ways. It's going to join the global community. Um, so two things happened. First of all, we integrated our supply chains and integrated our society and economy in such a vast and complicated way with China that it's now very difficult to divorce them. And in the
Mm.
process, we've ceded control over the principles of democracy and the principles of civil liberties and human rights to a nation that is, fundamentally at every level against these principles. That
Mm.
that as a party has made clear that they don't want this. This is not in the cards. And in the process, that means that we're now buying products from a government that's willing to use Uyghur slave labor and to commit a genocide against the people and to open concentration camps. We're buying products that are tainted by this labor, and so many American companies have been caught with their pants down, saying, "Oh, shoot! Like we are like we're caught in this position where like our supply chains are integrated. It's going to be difficult to divorce those supply chains because moving supply chains around, it's not easy. Like there are millions. Yeah,
No,
it's not.
if you're producing something in the hundreds of thousands or millions, it's a multi-year
Yeah, you don't
process.
just pick up the phone and say, yeah, move it to
No.
Vietnam. I like Vietnam better.
Hmm.
It's a long, expensive process. You have to
Hmm.
find the right people, the right location, the right facilities. It's just like I think the past few years have been an oh crap moment. We are working with psychopaths, and We need to figure out ways to get out of this. So there are a number of kind of these global cosmopolitan, trade supporters. So I think that Jeffrey Sachs is among the worst offenders. The man who falsely claimed to have reformed the Soviet economy, but actually just made it worse after the collapse of the Cold War. Is now making statements that we should, like, America should not comment, or Americans should not talk about human rights in China because America has its own human rights problem. Whenever anyone asks Goldman Sachs, or sorry, not Goldman Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs,
Jeffrey Sachs,
whenever people ask Jeffrey Sachs, what do you think about the Uyghur genocide? Like, aren't you worried about what's happening in China? That's the response. Well, we shouldn't talk about this. Just let's talk about America.
But yeah,
and it's
such a nihilistic way to look at it.
It's nihilistic.
Oh, we did something bad. We don't even have to. Don't worry about that. Look what you've done.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Well, it's also a logical error. I mean, the ancient Greeks, threw that one out. That goes back very far. It's a red herring, and it's intended to distract people from the real situation at hand. Well, you did it, so why can't I? Well, the U.S. does not run hundreds of concentration camps, 300 concentration camps where a tenth of the population is being taken away. Like, I mean, people talk about the prison industrial complex and the problems of young black men being put in prison, but these problems are not on the scale of what's happening in China. And on top of that, we have a functioning court and legal system, a functioning democracy where people can take to the streets and assemble if they need to. I mean, like these George Floyd protests over the past few years, this would not happen in China. And if it did, there would be a heavy-handed party response.
Oh yeah, the heel would be down. There would be no protest, of course.
So, there's Jeffrey Sachs. Also, a number of American companies have made official statements saying that they would like to keep trade and human rights separate, which is, that's a fun it's a
Such
weak stance, and it's a way of saying we don't care about human rights. It's a way of saying we're just here to make money. Keep the market separate from human rights. So I think that we've seen this fundamental realignment in the past few years about how we approach China. It's not just hawkish. Like, I think that people misuse that word hawkish, in the sense like we're out to hawk means you're going to aggressively go out there and you're going to you're going to threaten China, you're going to invade China, you're going to use military force. But fundamentally, what's happened is different. What has happened is that China has emerged as the hawkish aggressor, and the rest of the world, particularly developed democracies, have started to say, okay, this is going too far, and this is becoming unacceptable. And now across our society, there's been a lot of there's been a lack of elite consensus, in the Western democracies over what to do about China. But now that elite consensus is starting to form, and it's no longer going to be, we can just trade with China and keep the human rights separate. I think that these companies are like they're on the wrong side of history, and similar to in the early 1930s when Hollywood was a big supporter of Hitler and his film industry, and American companies were deeply ingrained in the Nazi economy as suppliers. IBM had participated in the Holocaust as a supplier of some of the technologies that were used. I think that when the history is written, many American companies are going to go down as the villains in this scenario. Might be a while it's going to be a while before that happens, but when the history is written, I think that will happen. And then there was one other point, one other trend I've been seeing. So what I just talked about was the shift of the shift from this trade liberal order to the standing up against China. But there's been this whole other shift. I think that there's been a realization that the Chinese system is not going to change, and ultimately, when you're working with an authoritarian regime, outside influence is almost never going to actually change a regime or change, how it goes about its own business. If a country, if Russia, if China, if Turkey, if Saudi Arabia, Iran, if these governments want to stay in power, they will stay in power, and they'll use brute force and repression to do it. And repression, contrary to what many kind of liberal Democrats believe, what they have believed since the end of the Cold War, repression is a very effective tool when used properly. That like if you're a dictator and you want to keep power, there are ways that you can keep power, and you don't need to reform. You don't need to respect human rights. You don't need to negotiate with your rivals. That's actually dangerous if you're a dictator, because one opening might just be the opening that allows the house of cards to fall. Like you gotta do what you can. So I think that we've come to the realization that American foreign policy, Western foreign policy to the world is not the center of the world. It's like what America does is not going to create a democracy in Afghanistan, for example. It's not going to create a democracy in China. It's not going to, get Putin out of power. It's not going to reform Russia. This kind of change, it either comes from within their own governments, from these elites. It comes from military leaders who don't like the current leader. It comes from political rivals. Maybe throw in protests too, popular protests that give more legitimacy to it. But America can invade a country and replace a regime, but that's not a good idea. But like a regime is going to stay the regime that it wants to be unless there's some kind of internal discontent. These changes come from the inside. They don't come from another country's foreign policy.